Our first topic is consumer and written agreements. Then I can move forward, taking a look at the definitions. We have consumer terminology, discontinued. Individuals obviously still continue, but the consumer reference for customer, discontinued. Therefore, sorry, I'll get through this, and Lou's up next, so I'll get through this quickly. Bottom left of these slides, you'll notice. Anybody think I've been talking too much the last few weeks? Okay. Bottom left of the slides, you'll notice there's a reference to how many forms are similar in this context on every slide. So, of course, I mentioned earlier 27 customer-related forms discontinued. There were 2 others that were agreements that no longer can be. And so that's just on the list December 1st. They just will not be retrievable. All right. Then I'm going to jump into, on this terminology issue of consumers and customer, essentially there's other terminology, and that's what we call self-represented parties or self-represented party. Defined in TRESA, I'm going to sort of just do that introduction. The committee identified with the legislation as far as what members can do, what registrants can do, and what they cannot do. And looking at the marketplace and trading activity is a big component of the Standard Forms Committee, is to know how to either do revisions or new forms to help members continue. And there are relationships that are identified and interactions with individuals that are likely self-represented party going forward that still needs some documentation. So I'm going to stop there, jump over to Lou Radomski. Could you help us out introducing the form, the benefit, and or the use going forward for members? On Form 216, this one is our new form. We're using the seller, self-represented party, acknowledgement, and consent. So folks, there are 8 of these altogether. And Lou, take it over.
All right. So to be clear, all right, I don't want people to have a misunderstanding. Self-represented party does not replace customer. Their customer is gone, and in fact, you should stop using it that word other than when you walk in as your own customer in a retail store. It's not a term to be used in real estate. And the reason behind it being discontinued is because the consumer was confused by customer. They saw everybody as a customer, whether you were a client or what we would understand in real estate to be a customer. So it got taken away. Self-represented party is not a replacement for that, just to be clear. So let's talk about self-represented party. It is essentially what it says it is. You're representing yourself. And at the end of the day, realtors can't provide any advice, and I'll get to what you can supply in a moment. Can't provide any advice. Anything that relies on your skill and judgment is not to be provided to a self-represented party. However, self-represented parties will be there, hopefully not many. And it's a choice that ultimately the industry is going to have to decide how they want to handle it. But they're there, they're covered by the legislation. And the issue we had is this, and I'll use an example. The legislation does say that as a service to your client, you can provide assistance to a self-represented party. All right, let me do that again. As a service to your client, you can provide assistance to a self-represented party. So I'll use one example that might come into play. Let's say, for argument's sake, you've got a listing, you're holding an open house, and in through the door comes someone who's ultimately going to decide to be a self-represented party. All right. So you can provide them with assistance. All right. So you show them the house, which again is a service to your client, the seller. They like it. They have somebody draw the offer for them. Let's say it's their lawyer. They submit it to you. You present it to the seller, and it's accepted. All right. So now I have a transaction. I have a trade going on. Self-represented party is the buyer. The seller is your client. And here's the thing. The deal closes. So my question to you, for you to consider, is would you like to be able to use that sale price as a comparable? Because the listing agreement provides permission to do it. It's in there, all right? But what have you got from a self-represented party? Because the RICO acknowledgement, which is mandatory if you're going to be a self-represented party, just talks about the fact that you're on your own. Go get independent professional advice. That might be a lawyer or somebody else, but nothing else. So what we did at OREA is we created this form that is, and I want to be perfectly clear, in addition to, it does not replace RICO's acknowledgement form. It's in addition to. Their form plays a role. It's prescribed by the statute. They have to prepare it. They've done it. It's going to be necessary for you to present it and to a self-represented party. Self-represented party should be signing that. But now we've got other issues like being able to use that price as a comparable, along with issues along electronic signatures, Family Law Act, stuff that ordinarily we've taken for granted because it's been captured by other forms. It's not captured in RICO's acknowledgement for the self-represented party. So this form is necessary in order to continue to practice in the event that you've got a self-represented party on one side of a transaction or a trade, and you want to be able to produce the same results at the end of the day. So in dealing with a self-represented party, effectively, what you should be doing is getting two acknowledgements signed. One of them is the RICO one, which is prescribed by the statute. They've created it. It's available on their site. And the other one is this one that we've created, and we've got one for a seller, and we've got one for a buyer, so that you've captured all the things that you would ordinarily do in a real estate transaction going forward. It's not an agreement, to be very clear. Let me sort of start off by just sort of referencing that. We're going to deal with that in a little more detail in a bit. But Section 13.3.1 of the General Regulation says, thou shalt not have an agreement with that doesn't include representation. So a self-represented party is not getting representation. So you can't have an agreement with them, but you can have an acknowledgement with them. And the acknowledgement is the form that we had on the screen, the 216. It's an acknowledgement. It's not an agreement. It's very clear that it's not an agreement. And the language that may have been interpreted to be an agreement has been vetted, removed, deleted. So clearly all it is an acknowledgement and consent. I think that does it.
Fantastic. I have, I'm going to go back to the form for a moment. Couple little things I just want to highlight, and then I'm going to identify some of the things streaming in that we're going to have to manage, because obviously we have a lot of inquiries, a lot of inquisitive minds, a lot of conversation. Absolutely respected. Let me jump in on this form first, add to what Lou had said. Remember, everybody, that you still have the importance within TRESA as we had within REBA, as far as no interfering with other people's clients. Right after that top section that highlights, it's not RICO's form, it's in addition to, but we do have the fact that you need to get the party to acknowledge they're not somebody else's client. They may say they're an SRP. You also want to make sure they're not somebody else's client. Lou alluded to it. I'm just highlighting a couple sections. Clause 3, you got to have a closer look at these forms before all the questions and everything else surface. Have a look, get familiar. Obviously, in December 1st, it's going to roll out. Professional advice. I've highlighted the fact that the seller can't rely on judgment, respect of a trade or skill or knowledge that Lou talked to. I put the section of the Act up. And then overall, page 2, a lot of the other legislative sections. Having said that, there is a question looking at whether or not there'll be forms explained file. I see that. I see many of them on our Q&A. There absolutely will be. I think it's important that we continue to strive. Obviously, there's a lot of ramp up as far as the work that's done on the forms, the revisions, the new forms, the webinar, the outreach. So we are definitely getting to some of these. We appreciate your patience in rolling them out. The timeline was essentially publishing of August 2nd, knowing what's in the Act, what's in the regs. Really, everybody just kind of got on the train and just kept going. And we're still going. The other thing I wanted to comment, so thank you for those questions, is essentially, I'm just going to move along my slides here. I want to keep going. Where is that gone? Another member question, I think. Yes, here we go. As far as Lou, maybe you can quickly respond. Is FinTrack ID necessary for SRP buyers? We've heard this in many versions. Anybody who's not a client, is identification of the proceeds of crime, money laundering, terrorist financing necessary? Short answer to this, Lou?
There are many statutes that regulate what you do in the practice of real estate that are outside of the new statute TRESA. And one of those is the money laundering, proceeds crime money laundering statute. And it prescribes in no uncertain terms that when you're working with someone, you have to identify them. And so if you've got an SRP involved in a trade, you have an obligation to identify them, and at the end of the day, make multiple attempts if they're giving you some difficulty getting the identification. And if they refuse to provide you with the identification, then at the end of the day, there are other solutions that have been prescribed by FinTrack that may include reporting them for not being cooperative, or potentially as a money laundering component in the transaction. In any event, that hasn't gone away. You do have an obligation to go on and identify them, regardless of whether they're an SRP or otherwise.
Perfect. Thank you. We have had many of these questions, therefore I've been able to resource some of the slides. So thank you, Lou, for that. Now, we have a lot of individual situation questions. I can't imagine of 5,000 or 6,000 members attending. Thank you, everyone. I cannot imagine answering individual, either salesperson, broker of record, manager, admin, whoever is asking these. They cannot be managed, but we are happy to try to continue to provide the content so that you can digest the resources and the templates available. So for all intents and purposes, we're trying to answer some of these questions along the way, but we're going to continue in our content. And don't forget, we'll stay in a little bit at the end. Actually, we have a special treat for you at the end of the session. We're going to do a little bit of a lightning round. I'm accumulating some short questions. I'm accumulating other short questions, or really questions that can be answered in short before we leave today. But we need to get through the content. Our next topic is consumers and written agreements. And we kind of started that a little bit. They're not technically agreements. It's not an agreement for the SRP 216 and the other SRP acknowledgement consent forms. Ultimately, we're moving into the concept of consumers and really client agreements more than anything else. On that topic, looking at our first area, and that is our primary listing agreements and buyer representation agreements. What we'd like to share with you, some of you may be well aware of some of the changes, but we have the TRESA and a few more. So right now I'm going to get Lou to hit the nail on the head on the TRESA revisions. I'm going to try to pull up the resources while he's doing that to show you a little closer up. And then I'll finish up with some of the other little areas, and then we'll move in to some of the other quick questions. Lou, can you touch on what's revised on our listing agreement due to TRESA?
Okay, so the big revision is one that came in really not all that long ago, supported by RICO. It's something that I've been a fan of for decades, to be honest. I used to call it designated agency. Now it's called designated representation, and it's captured by the statute going forward. So at the end of the day, the concept behind it is this. I've got ABC Realty, and I've got an individual in ABC Realty who's designated as the representative for the listing, because they're the ones who brought the listing into the company. And I've got a different designated representative, another salesperson at the brokerage, who has brought in the buyer, got them signed up on a BRA. So essentially, I've got two different designated representatives. So now under the changes, the change to legislation, it is a change. That's no longer considered to be multiple representation, because you've got different salespeople involved with each one of those two parties to the transaction, to the trade. And that, quite frankly, when you think about how things are being processed today, if I've got two salespeople at the same brokerage, one's got the seller and the other's got the buyer, they kind of treat them like their own client anyways. While that's not permitted under the current statute, it's now legal coming effective December 1st, because we do recognize that. And we'll give you some of the exceptions to the rule going forward with multiple representation, because there are some exceptions for that. Now, having said that, at the end of the day, we've created a form that is multitasked, is a nice way of saying it. It offers more than one thing, and I'll explain why that works. So you'll notice the sentence up on the screen that says this listing is a designated representation agreement where the brokerage is designated as salesperson. So let me tell you what the legislation says. Legislation has two definitions. One's called a representation agreement, which is what we have before December 1. It's a brokerage representation agreement, like a listing. Remember, all the contracts currently before December 1 are with the brokerage and not with the individual. And going forward on December 1, you have the availability by filling in somebody's name to create what's known as, and this is the second definition in the legislation, is a designated representation agreement. So what a designated representation agreement is, the brokerage has, I want to be clear about that, the brokerage has designated an individual in the brokerage, and it can be more than one, be a variety. You can't use the word team, all right, because the legislation doesn't recognize team, but it does recognize individuals, more than one. You put them on in that designated representation slot, and you've converted the agreement from a representation agreement, which would have been a brokerage agreement, which is still available, to a designated representation agreement with those designated representatives now providing representation and services, and the brokerage is no longer providing representation but only services. So I'm sort of rushing through it quickly, but that's essentially how the legislation works. And the idea behind it is it's a choice. It's a transaction by transaction arrangement that you decide upon. So by way of difference, Alberta, which started this whole process in 2014. Under their legislation, the brokerage has to make a decision which direction they want to take. Do they want to be brokerage representation, or do they want to have designated representation? And once that brokerage has made that decision, going forward, that's all that's available to them. In Ontario, it's a transaction by transaction basis. Essentially, you can have brokerage representation on one, designated representation on the next transaction, so you can change from one to the next. The idea being is that I imagine that most brokerages are going to come to some policy decisions as to what they expect from their membership. And we've, during our previous presentations, we've heard all variety of different choices that people are going to make going forward. So at the end of the day, we leave it to each brokerage to make those decisions. All right. The other thing that I want to point out is you're going to bring in, the change to the expiry date thing. Under the current status, if I have any kind of a contract that goes for longer than 6 months, I have to have the initials on the page. And that's changed now, regardless of how long the period is for whatever the agreement is. 1 day, 1 month, 6 months, 6 years, you initial that every single time. And so that's a change that happened to through the legislation as well. I think I covered most of that. We do have a variety of different multiple representation paragraphs in them, and they identify different solutions. And we're gonna talk about that going forward. And those are the arrows that you see. And actually, you see them on the screen. There are going to be 4 different sections with multiple representation. Maybe we'll just introduce them summarily. First one is, I call it common law. It's what's going on now. Next one is going to be multiple representation with a limited services representation. We'll talk about that when we hit the next form. There is multiple representation and designated representation. And there will be a 4th one. And the 4th one is going to be multiple representation when there's a designated representative and brokerage representation at the same time. All right. And that creates multiple representation as well. And they're set out in the forms to give the individual, the consumer who's contracting with you, an understanding of how those different ones work. I think Perfect. I covered most of it.
Perfect. Yep. I think the intro and the overview is fantastic. I'm going to go back to page 1 for a moment. There's one more thing we want to cover, which is a little more than TRESA, and that is on the form. There have been a revision. There's been a couple revisions oriented around, this was earlier in the year, the CREA Code of Ethics, new cooperation policy. It's not that we're getting the forms to indicate consent, nothing like that, but to identify with them under the definitions section. So there's a public marketing definition that we've added to the end of the definitions section. And then when we look at the clause 3, and I'm going to go one step further right here. Clause 6, the marketing clause. We've added in that the seller acknowledges information about the 3-day rule. Now, there are some exceptions, folks. We just want to identify, we're not able to answer, the 10 questions. This is a January 1st. I wanted to put the visual in front of you. If you haven't heard about it, if you haven't seen it, this was a decision back in the spring of 2023. Ultimately, the new duty of cooperation under the Realtor Code. You should have a read up on it. I'm sure your brokerages are familiar. I've got the date. The policy comes into effect January 3rd, 2024. CREA will have some information on their website, but the Standard Forms Committee considered this and wanted to go forward with some minor adjustment to bring it to light for the conversation between the member and the seller. I'm going to leave that on the table. Any questions, answers through your brokerage, through CREA, that is information, so there's a discussion opportunity. Outside of that, we're going to go to our next form. Now, I do see a number of questions oriented around will the licensees have the forms? We said earlier in a number of times that we commenced quite early distribution to our licensees, 3 weeks earlier than a normal year, asked them to hone in for December 1st. Our licensees have committed and confirmed to December 1st for fillable forms. Check with your licensee platform. Other than that, I think I saw a couple of very, very frequent questions around, are we going to educate consumers? Folks, I'm sure consumers are going to get educated, but you're amidst getting educated. Be careful what you ask for. Right now, OREA's focus is helping members, having their back, having the resources, having training, self-directed tools so that you can and your brokerages for managers and broker of records with us here today. So realtors and members can actually manage these changes and updates. Thereafter, I'm sure the members will do a fantastic job. As far as OREA Forms, we do not have a focus to go educate consumers. Our biggest focus right now, and I think many can appreciate, at least there's no commitment on the OREA Forms side for consumer education. Our commitment right now is helping members with the best tools, templates that's available with some educational resources. So I'm going to move forward from there. There's one more form. We want to get through the topics, folks. And I'll talk about an offering to the brokerages and the boards out there as far as outreach, our presentations. But this webinar is about getting information on the table. Some of you already are very aware from having taken the TRESA presentations, watching the TRESA videos, reading the TRESA articles on OREA.com, and or visiting the RICO site. So I'm sure some of this is familiar, but we want to reiterate and get to the forms and then add more, because there's more than the TRESA and there's more heads up market calendars too. So Lou, you alluded to contents of written client limited services representation agreement. What I'd like to do just before you tackle this very briefly is I want to highlight, everybody's familiar with the listing agreement, 3-page. You can see the blue highlights. We're using Form 200, or even if you think of Form 300, if you can imagine these as the same content, but for new purpose on the basis of potentially unique, limited type of environment when you're dealing with individuals that are asking you for some service or representation. So I've got the listing agreement across the top. They're identical, except for the changes that Lou is about to hone in on. Lou, do you want to take it over and talk about our new limited services representation agreements that the brokerage and the members could initiate, and the purpose, perhaps the benefits in certain situations?
Okay, so let me start by using a word that I said you weren't to use again, which is the word customer. And I'm going to make it a personal example. A number of years ago, my father passed away, and he owned a condo, which I had no interest in keeping. So I was going to put it up for sale and sell it. So what I did is it was in a building. I went down to the management office in the building, asked the property manager if they could give me the name of somebody who sold in that building. And that was their farm, marketplace, call it whatever you want. And they gave me a name, and I called the woman up and I said to her that my father had passed away. There was a condo I wanted to sell. I didn't want to sign a listing. And I offered her the following proposal. I'm going to put a key down in the management office. You come pick it up anytime you want. Show the unit to whoever you want. When you've got an offer, bring it to me. If I find it acceptable, I'll pay you a commission. I'll sign a commission agreement, pay you a commission. So at the end of the day, I'm not really a client. All right. What I am is somebody who's looking for a sale of the property and go from there. And I don't want to list it. It's not necessary to put it on the MLS, but I do want it sold. So at the end of the day, because of 13.3.1, which says thou shalt not have an agreement with anyone unless it includes representation, that protocol that I just described with my father and his unit wouldn't work today. All right. Because in order to do that, I would have to have some kind of a representation agreement set up. All right. But I didn't want one, I wouldn't want one that sort of, uh, let's call it a full tilt service representation agreement, call it what you want. I'm looking for one particular service going forward, and that's it. Bring me an offer, sell my unit, and I'll pay a commission. So we've created this form that addresses that, and it covers a whole variety of business models. The one I use as an example is just one of them. Think of a mere posting where the only thing you want from a brokerage is for them to put the property on MLS. All right. And clearly you don't want any more. That's a limited service arrangement, limited service and representation agreement. So we have this form that we've created to address a variety of different models that have limited services. And as I say, this one has let's call it a mandatory schedule. It's required, and you'll notice on the left hand side the second red arrow, sort of halfway down the page, identifies Schedule A, which is the component that's added. It's very clear. It's at the top just to draw people's attention to the fact that you're going to have to fill it in. You can have other schedules, of course, but Schedule A is the one that's going to be important. And it talks about us that Schedule is going to set out whatever the limitations are, whatever the representation limitations are, whatever your prescribed goals are, and so on and so forth. And I'll use other examples. This is the seller side. We have one for the buyer side. All right. And on the right-hand side is Schedule A, and it's introduced. And I saw a question. This has a little Latin in it, and it has Latin in it for a particular reason, because I want to make sure that we didn't exclude other things in the agreement. So it says this schedule to the agreement, and the Latin is in italics. It's inter alia, which means among others. So in other words, in addition to whatever else is in this form, this is the stuff that's going on with respect to this. And I might put in limitations like the only thing you're doing for me or I'm doing for you is I'm bringing you an offer. That's it. That's the limited service I'm providing. Nothing else, nothing more. Say goodbye. All right. And it makes it clear that this is limited. And the idea behind the limitation is this. You've agreed, both of you, you and the consumer, the seller in this particular case, that the only thing you're doing for them is bringing them an offer. They can't all of a sudden turn around to you without some changes and say to you, oh, by the way, you brought me an offer. I didn't like it. So I like you. Let's go market the property. Well, you don't have to do that. You've sort of limited what your services are going to be, limited what your representation is going to be, and that might generate a different kind of conversation. So you can go beyond whatever the limitations are, but this form limits it, those services. All right. On the buyer side, it may be, for example, and I'll use this as an example. We talked about SRP. They're self-represented. They come into your open house. You show them the open house. And they go, this is a nice place, but this is not what I'm looking for. I imagine there's a lot of people who say, well, I've got other places. Do you want to work with me? We'll find you some other stuff. Well, guess what? You can't have an agreement with an SRP unless it includes representation. So we're going to have a buyer side that may have a limitation on, I'm going to show you 4 properties, and if you buy one, then you're going to engage me in terms of representation. And so you can have this on the buyer side as well. You can do all kinds of, there's a lot of flexibility available here, and gives you an option to address the requirements of the statute, which says you can't have an agreement with anyone unless it includes representation. And this does that in a limited fashion. So as I say, it'll come in handy, would be an understatement, in a variety of different business models that are going on there now. And you've got the language in the form to be able to address that.
Perfect. Thank you, Lou. I'm going to address just a couple little questions, and we're going to jump forward on our agenda. One, which is very timely and very topical. Somebody asked about the Seller Commission Agreement Form 202. I'm putting up what was the discontinued form, so please be aware that that type of agreement is not allowable under, and I'm just going to bounce right on back to our section in the Act where it said you cannot have an agreement with anyone unless it has representation. Hence why it's one of the relationship situations that you might find this particular form handy, but brokerage policies, member options, we do not make any one or more form particular to a situation, nor do we make anything mandatory. But to answer the question, which was, will Form 202 still be available or can it still exist? And the answer would be no, because it's an agreement that doesn't have representation with a buyer or seller regarding a trade. So moving on, a couple of other little things as far as, okay, I'm going to move on because I wrote something down. I'll remember it later. So I did want to sort of highlight, actually, maybe this will do the job on both of these forms, because we're going to jump into the other forms. We've got limited time, so we're going to jump on one question only, and that is, oopsie, sorry, can a salesperson insert themselves? We had a lot of broker of record managers when designated representation. There's a lot of questions about designated representation. This in particular probably was a frequent question that asked, can people just come in and drop files on my desk as a broker manager, sort of asking, can a salesperson just arbitrarily designate themselves on any listing or buyer representation? We've got two different types of client agreements, both of them, the listing agreement, buyer representation, or the limited services representation for all the same parties. They both have designated rep. Lou, what's your comment as far as, is this just an arbitrary right of the salesperson? Can you give a brief response what the parameter of the designated representation option is?
So the language in the statute is really clear. It is the brokerage who designates the individual whose name goes into whether it be the listing agreement or the buyer representation agreement. That's where it comes from. At the end of the day, the issue isn't that. The issue is, what's your policy, what's your arrangement with the individual salespeople, brokers in the office, all right? At the end of the day, if I'm not mistaken, it's not unusual. In fact, it's quite acceptable for the brokerage by contractual arrangement with each salesperson to say, okay, you can sign the listing agreement on behalf of the brokerage. In other words, you're giving them authorization to do that. Well, if that's the case, they're preparing the form on behalf of the brokerage. It's a brokerage designating, but it's the individual who's signing the form on behalf of the brokerage. So if a name appears of the designated representative in that slot, it's essentially the brokerage who's designated it. This person's just signing the form. And that means that at the end of the day, it's going to fall upon the brokerage to make sure their policies are clear about what direction they want to take the brokerage in, and they make sure that they've got it covered. And so by way of an example, I had in one of our presentations, we had an individual who was adamant that he didn't want to use designated representation in his brokerage choice policy of his own. And he said, what's to prevent the individual salesperson from putting their name in? I said, nothing. You probably made that arrangement with them when you signed the contract with them as to who fills in the form. So you want to change that, you're going to have to change not only your policy, but you're also going to have to change how the individual contracts get signed. You're going to have to remove the authorization from the salespeople in your office, and the only person allowed to sign any contracts is going to have to be the broker of record, you. So if that's a direction you want to take, then that's how you control it. Other than that, when you give that authority to somebody else, then if they abuse it somehow, then it's going to have to be between you and them as to how you resolve that issue. You're muted.
Well, they see I'm a talking head. I try not to be. I try to engage. Thank you, Lou. We have about 100 questions, and I'm only going to answer this one more time because I'm hoping that the messaging and the recording and everything else about it is going to be clear. We want to make sure we're very brief on the content of the forums and we're streaming through. When will the forums, fillable or otherwise, be available? And we mentioned that we provided them early on. We asked for all of our licensees, whether it's SkySlope, Dotloop, Lone Wolf, WebForce, whatever it is, that they aim for December 1st. Check in with your licensees. Once one is there, all of them should be to answer your question. Somebody asked, will they be in will the revisions be in italics or colored or highlighted? And the answer is no. These are contracts, most of them. You don't want You don't want that. The summary of revisions file is vital. So have a look at it because it does highlight for you so you can find them. I'm going to move on. We have seller options for seller offer directions. This is probably the most discussed, most contentious. There's a lot of discussion about a lot of these topics. Lou, we're going to do the skinny of this topic as far as how the legislation establishes new seller options. I'm going to present the form on this slide, Form 209. The committee established a new form for seller direction to the brokerage. So Lou, without too much parameter, let's highlight the purpose of the form and perhaps content around it. And then we'll sort of jump to communications without too many questions that we have and without too many examples. Run it.
All right. And in all our presentations in the past, this has generated the most discussion. So we're gonna try and keep it as concise as we possibly can. So let me start by telling you what the legislation says. It's very clear. The legislation says that when you have competing offers, you've got to share the number with every one of the competing offers. Well, nothing's changed. Section 26 Code of Ethics does that now, and it's repeated. All right. The second part, this is the new part. It says if the seller directs you in writing, then you can share the substance, all or part, and I'm paraphrasing, with all the other competing offers. All right. And therein lies the end of the rules. We're done. There are no other rules. So as you can see, there's very little precision here. There's no timing. There's no when do I have to make a decision? Can I change my mind? And because there are no details as to how this is to be implemented, I can see that it's going to change, and people are going to have to sit down, make some policies for the brokerage as to how they want to proceed with this thing, if at all, because I'm sure some brokerage is going to say, look, we find this to be much too open-ended and without any certainty, so we're not going to involve ourselves in this. There are going to be other brokers who say, this is a great idea. Thank goodness we've got this transparency now, and away you go. So at the end of the day, there are no rules. All right. So having said that, the rules are, there is one more rule, and it's the last bullet on this page. There's no sharing of personal information. So while you can share substance, all or part, you can't share any personal information like names and so on and so forth. Okay, so having said that, the parameters are open-ended. So let's talk about the fact that I have 5 competing offers. I can share one element of that competing offer, but I have to share with all the other competing offers. Okay. So now the thing is, let's say I decide to share price. So I share that price with all 5 competing offers. I tell them the price is whatever the number is. And I would have to have a written direction. And this form accomplishes that. This form gives you the written direction from the seller to say, this is what we want you to do. And it's open-ended. So in other words, we've highlighted what some of the substances will be, and you get them to initial the box, and there's place for additional one. Should we not have covered the one that you want to share the substance on it, but price, deposits, conditions, you name it. All right. But whatever you share with everybody. All right. And that's really what it boils down to. It can get a little more complex than that. But at the end of the day, that's what this form is meant to address. It's meant to address the written direction to share substance, all or part, with all the competing offers. All right.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask Cassandra, are we going to talk about the clause?
Yes, we are actually. I've moved it to another slide. We've talked many times, and we've said it in our other earlier October webinar, and we said it online. I'm just sort of moving some of the content to the back. We're going to provide the clause. It's not a secret. We've talked about it for a month or so. We have a new standard clause. Lou, just the very essence and where the arrow is, the purpose of it being worded as such to the revocation if a buyer does not want to participate in sharing of substance of offer negotiations. Go ahead.
All right. So we wanted to give some control to the buyer, because the seller is the one who directs you to share substance, all or part. And what if the buyer doesn't want to be a party to that kind of sharing? They go, well, wait a minute. All right. I like this house. I'm prepared to put in an offer, but I like the old system, the blind bidding. I don't want anybody to know what my offer price is. And so we've drafted this clause that's in the form of a revocable. And for those of people say, but the seller hasn't accepted it. Well, the seller hasn't accepted it when you've got an irrevocable clause on the front of the offer. And what gives that irrevocable teeth is the seal that's on the back of the offer. So at the end of the day, it gives the buyer the opportunity that if the clause or if the content of any part of the content is shared, that the offer becomes revoked and is no longer a competing offer, and away you go. So we've crafted that to give them some control. I know that Rico has talked about making confidential offer, and this essentially accomplishes that goal. All right, and at the end of the day. The idea is, the buyer has some choices. So one parameter that's maybe a little bizarre, going back to my 5 competing offers, one of them has this clause in it that says you share anything and this offer is over and null and void and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, this is not the price I'm going to share. I'm going to share the price from one of the other offers that doesn't have this clause in it. I would have to share it with all 5, but I can't share this one. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. Okay.
Options. And folks, you're going to have 20 questions around this, probably every other week, and you're going to cross with each other, and there'll be more questions. All depends on how people roll it out. We've got a template clause. Nothing is mandatory. Your broker of record or your brokerage management may have a commentary. We've got in the entire clause booklet, we've got the recommendation that, and it always has been, members use clauses and forms to make sure they suit the individual situation. So I'm going to leave it on the table there. We're going to carry on. I do want to say one thing about another form that has been edited. We won't deep dive. Looking at this form that's been around for about 6 years, Form 652, it's about legislative disclosure. So it's brokerage to brokerage communication about number of competing offers that might create multiple representation. And then you have anything around remuneration and commission. There's 2 things highlighted on this form, and we're going to move forward. And that is the fact that you can check off that you have had seller communication. Remember to both, and you'll see that as a note, both brokerages need to have follow-up, because the minute that it's identified, a seller can change that. You'll see the second arrow that identifies a little bit about designated representation as far as identifying that multiple representation when it occurs. Now I'm going to go forward to our disclosures, because that's also a hyper topic in a sense of hypersensitive, not hyper people. So we have disclosure and consumer communications. Now Lou has alluded to this, and I kind of compared the listing and the limited services representation. You'll notice that there's familiarity. We have Form 325, and folks, this has a slight change. Anybody that has seen the October 25th webinar, Forms webinar, or if you've been at one of our presentations around the province with literally hundreds of broker of record managers across the province, you will notice Form 325. I'm going to highlight it, but really I think Lou would also agree that there's essentially a consolidation of the different types of multiple representation. The one we've added, and all I'm saying here is that there's a different situation, some conversation that had been happening out there, and some digestion of TRESA and really what TRESA says. Ultimately, multiple representation may occur where there's a designated representation and brokerage representation. So these are the options. So this is a parallel, bottom left corner. You'll see there's 2 of these forms, one for a buyer, one for a seller. So I'm going to see if Lou has any added comment before we go forward on the other summary form that includes some of this, which is the confirmation, cooperation, representation. Is there anything addition you want to add, Lou, on 325, 326?
We should identify why we have a form like this when
yes, good point. Thank you.
As it currently stands, the only thing you see when there's multiple I shouldn't say the only thing, there are some exceptions. There are brokerages who do this kind of thing currently, but generally speaking, when there's multiple rep today, what we have is the only thing you see that consent box on 320 confirmation cooperation form, where you get the buyer and the seller to put their initials saying it's okay to go ahead with multiple representation. The legislation changed, right? And it said that in circumstances where you're dealing with a client or prospective client in multiple representation, then you have to do some disclosure. And it talks in the legislation what the disclosure is. And we've identified the different kinds of multiple rep and what they are. And you'll notice at the top of the form, it is a disclosure form. All right. And we've covered what is potentially the different kinds of multiple representation, including the last one that Cassandra alluded to, which is, by the way, is a section in the statute. All right. It talks about brokerage representation and designated representation in the same trade. And that means at the end of the day, if the designated representative is with the brokerage and the brokerage is on the other side of the transaction without a designated representation, that's considered to be multiple rep, and that's the last oval that you see. So there are circumstances where one or more of these may come up. And you just have to identify that. You have to do your disclosure because the legislation says thou shalt not have multiple rep unless, and this is the unless part. All right. So we got it covered. It's going to come up. You need to know, and we leave it to you to make a determination when somebody's become a prospective client in multiple rep. Like when does it look like it's going to become multiple rep? You got to get this signed, one for the buyer, one for the seller, and you move forward.
Yes, that's a really
all right. And thank you for bringing up that last little portion of the screen. It says not only do I have to disclose, but once you've disclosed that, they need to consent to it being okay. In other words, I'm prepared to engage in multiple representation, not necessarily on the trade. So you're going to get that in there. You're going to get them to consent on this form, and then ultimately one more thing. All right, I love it with multiple rep. When the trade actually comes together like it does today, all right, you're also going to get them to consent to buyer and seller to consent to the trade in multiple representation on the 320, all right, which is the confirmation cooperation form. Okay.
Great
all right.
segue.
I think I covered
Great
it.
segue. No, that's fantastic, Lou. Great segue. We like that. I'm going to drive it right to the 320 with two more forms. So thank you, everybody, for hanging in. And we really appreciate the extra time. I think it's very difficult. We spent 2 hours talking about all of this, and we're trying to snapshot and answer a little bit here and there. Lou, you segued into Form 320, which is really much closer to the negotiation. But I do want to highlight for everybody, again, the similar relationships consistent with the listing agreement, buyer rep, the multiple representation disclosure sections, and then the confirmation here. Any additional reference as far as affirmations before negotiations? Lou, anything about 320 that you want to comment? Oh, you're on mute. Hey, I got you back. You're on mute.
My turn. Yep. Sorry about that. Thank you. So we tried to address different situations because designated rep is a recent phenomenon in the legislation. It was done with the support of RICO. RICO was, in fact, the one that thought this would be a great idea. I tend to agree. It has its supreme benefits, but it also comes with identifying a variety of different situations that everybody needs to understand. We've tried to do that in confirmation cooperation. For example, in the past, where we've had two people from the same brokerage involved in a trade, that was multiple rep. Well, guess what? If it's a designated representative on one side and a designated representative on the other side from the same brokerage, it's in the same trade, then essentially it's not multiple rep. In fact, that was the purpose of bringing that in. So you see on the screen in D1, this is the seller side. Listing brokerage designated rep represents more than one client. That's multiple rep. All right. So I'm the designated rep. I brought in a listing to the brokerage. I also, as it turns out, signed up a buyer who liked the house that I had listed, and the buyer is also represented in a designated representation agreement because it's the same individual on both sides. All right. So guess what? I have designated representation. Or I have, multiple representation. Where it's different designated reps, a different one for the buyer, a different one for the seller. It's not multiple representation. And you have to remember something I said earlier on, and I'll end with this one, that once you have designated representation, it's the designated representative who's providing representation and services. The brokerage is only providing services, which is D3. So you might be checking that box in those circumstances as well.
Yes, those were added, folks, from the original supplement package. So we encourage you to use the most recent forms. There was a lot of education in advance, but a lot of digestion, a lot of conversation, a lot of balls in the air, a lot of exchange. RICO members, internal team, Lou and myself. So as of today, all the final forms are up, and you will be notified if there's any revisions. Ultimately, at this point, I think under the December 1st auspices, you want to go to the OREA.com site for the most recent forms and or from this webinar here. And this is one of the changes. Having said that, I'm going to move into one last form. Thank you very much, Lou. Great continuity as we move along. And that's where the manageability, not only from the parallel forms reduction of the number of, but also from the continuity within the forms. We do have a fair amount of questions. I'm going to get to those just right after we get to this last area of communications and having integrity. And that's going to be this last form, which is an introduction. Somebody had asked, I think, about the SRP, whether it was in addition to RICO. At the top of these forms, on the SRP acknowledgement consent form that we did have a bold paragraph saying, in addition to. Please do not be confused. No OREA forms will replace either of the two prescribed forms from RICO. So that's the first thing we want to highlight. The Working with a Realtor committee felt is still very purposeful, very valuable as a tool to summarize. Lou, do you want to touch on the two areas, just identifying what we've added into this in addition to much of our communication around how that Working with a Realtor can help summarize for consumers, as well as a brokerage tool for having acknowledgements. Go ahead, Lou.
All right, so it's I'd like to refer to this like an enhancement, and sort of to repeat what you just said, Cassandra. These are not to replace the information guide. It's in addition to, and let's be frank, as it stands currently, the Working with a Realtor that you used before December 1 wasn't mandatory. What was mandatory is what was in Section 10 of the Code of Ethics. It said information before agreements, and the Working with a Realtor went a long way towards dealing with that issue. This is something similar, and it does a couple of things. And you'll notice in the center of the screen, it talks is in addition to the prescribed and required trust and real estate services information guide. All right, that's mandatory. You're not going to get away from that. But this does give you some help and an assistance. I'm a fan of being able to prove I did what I said I did, and I like it in writing. So one of the things that this does is there's an acknowledgement in this form, and you'll see that on the screen now. Because what it says in the legislation in the general reg is that you got to give the consumer the info guide. You have to explain it. Let's be clear about that. And if there's an issue later on and somebody files a complaint, I'm sure one of the questions that Rico's going to ask, did you give them the info guide? Well, yeah. Did you explain it to them? You go, yeah. And then the consumer's going to say, no, you didn't. And so we've got something in here that gives you some evidence or proof that you did what you said you did. So you get them to fill that in, initial, and you've got something to give you some strength and support for the statement you're making about providing it. We've got one for an SRP. There's another acknowledgement in the form too, to say that you gave them the SRP from RICO, and it was explained to them and they acknowledged receiving it. So at the end of the day, those are two mandatory forms, and we've got a Working with a Realtor that describes relationships, not unlike what we do currently. Try as much as we possibly can to make it understandable for a consumer going forward. But again, these do not replace the RICO forms. They are in addition to.
Thank you. And everybody's going to have an opportunity to have a look at these. The summary revisions file will answer many, many, many of your questions that are asking. So how do we identify what's been changed? Have a look at the summary of revisions file. It's our methodology every year for members. Lou, thank you. I'm going to do two things. I want to respect everybody. It is 2:10. I want to do a quick summary, but I have two things to tell people: that we're going to do a little summary, and we're going to just give you a couple of mark your calendars. We are going to have 3 opportunities for questions and answers, and you ask, we answer. Normally when we get get to those. We're 40, 50, 60 questions and answers strong. But let me do this first. We have a little summary. It's that time of year. We covered some of our annual updates, consumer and written agreements, terminology, seller options, direction forms, multiple communication forms. We had the disclosure as far as multiple representation, which is very pointed to how the legislation now asks prospective clients as well as the clients that are in it. Then we have confirmations. Ultimately, the consumer communication to make sure we have some accountability within our files, as well as just generally our practices. So we hope those are all helpful. I have this area here. Mark your calendar, January 31st. Very important. It's the next monthly forms webinar. You'll notice the title, sort of new forms, you ask, we answer. We're going to provide you any opportunity. We'll get to as many. I know in past years, Part B, we've had, I think, up to 64 questions. When I look at the more recent happenings, we have 2 special episodes of the standard. December 7th, along the same line as Forms and TRESA, you ask, we answer, pressing questions. It's a live broadcast. That's on December 7th, Thursday at 11, as well as January 25th, Thursday at 11.